Shabbat Shalom. Aliza Kline is a dynamic leader and social entrepreneur. She is co-founder and CEO of OneTable, a powerful platform for young adults to engage in Jewish life, practice, and community by hosting and participating in peer-led Shabbat dinners. Since OneTable launched in 2014, more than 190,000 young adults in 600 cities across the country have participated. OneTable has been featured in New York Times, NPR, and dozens of local news outlets. It gives us great pleasure, Aliza, to have you here as part of our Shabbaton, and I am thrilled to welcome you to the Bima. We are all very much looking forward to hearing from you today.
Shabbat Shalom. It's January, so that means my email inbox, and probably yours, and my social media feeds are brimming with offers to build habits, healthy habits for the best year yet. I like the optimism, and often the accompanying warning, change can be hard, like really hard, to maintain. I've been studying habit formation for a number of years for my work at OneTable. After all, our goal is for an entire generation of Jewish adults to adopt one of our most ancient Jewish practices, Shabbat, but not as a one-off, rather as an ongoing practice. We will know we are successful when this practice becomes internalized, habitual, integrated into how people live and interact in the world. And unlike bad habits, there's literally no harm in trying it out again and again. That's the beauty of a weekly ritual. It's always coming around again, ready when we are. One of my favorite Shabbat stories actually takes place on a Tuesday. It's from the 18th century, disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, a founder of Hasidism. Two young yeshiva students, the very same who grew up to be the scholars, Reb Zusha and Reb Elimelech, were wandering. This was their wandering years. They were learning Torah and experiencing life as curious, ambitious students. And they loved Shabbat. Like every Friday, wherever they were, they would stop their study midday, they would bathe in a mikveh, they would don their clean white clothing and elegant fur shtreimels. They would join local community celebrations with singing and praying and dancing and fresh challah and chicken soup and wine, the whole 9 yards. And they were transported, delighted, elevated. But as spiritual seekers often do, they began to question whether this Shabbat high was real or, God forbid, self-generated. What if they were somehow manufacturing this feeling? So they decided to test it by celebrating Shabbat on a Tuesday. They stopped their study midday. They bathed in the mikveh. They donned their white clothes and they put on their beautiful fur shtreimels. They gathered with friends, singing and praying and dancing, and enjoyed fresh challah and chicken soup and wine, the whole 9 yards. And they were transported, delighted, elevated. It felt like Shabbos, totally, oy vavoy. So they went to their Rebbe, the Maggid of Mezrich. We made it up. We have been fabricating this whole time. What have we done? And the Rebbe says, well, where do you think Shabbat goes the rest of the week? It's always here. You just created the vessel to elevate yourself to that experience. You can access it any time. I love this story. I love it because it grants us all permission to access Jewish wisdom, celebration, tradition, and it reminds us that the joy of connection we seek is always there. And I also love it because we could all use a taste of Shabbat, or a reminder of Shabbat's potential, even on a Tuesday. It sure seems like our world needs Shabbat now, more than ever. You heard Rabbi Cosgrove speaking earlier today. One need not look far to understand how troubled and hurt we are and how much we need this. And yet, it can often feel beyond our reach. We're in the midst, as you know, of rereading Shemot, the book of Exodus, transporting us back to Mitzrayim, the Hebrew for Egypt, which translates to a narrow place. And when we are in that place, like the bottom of a valley, or maybe in a depression, we cannot, by definition, see how we will get out of it. This memory of being in a narrow place is imprinted on our Jewish psyche. But thankfully, so is the power of faith that we would endure and that we'd get to freedom, to the promised land. The question is, how do we sustain that faith? And what wells can we draw on to sustain us? In this week's parasha, Bo, which translates as come, we get closer and closer to freedom, while Pharaoh's heart is simultaneously hardened. God amps up the plagues. Ultimately, God enacts the final plague, striking down the firstborn in the land of Egypt, except those of the house of Israel. Pharaoh now allows the Israelites to leave, and we are exalted. We are seeing the wondrous power which Adonai has wielded against the Egyptians. Right from the chapter, the people feared Adonai, and they had faith in Adonai and in God's servant Moshe. Vayar'u ha'am et Adonai va'aminu ba'Adonai. They believed and they had faith. But what must have felt like ecstatic disbelief, the Israelites felt despair, seeing one plague after another fail to soften Pharaoh's heart. Our Midrash teaches that they held to their faith, despite not knowing. If you have hoped and have not been saved, hope and hope again, from Midrash Rabbah. Hope and faith are like muscle memory. We remember times when our prayers were answered, when things worked out all right, when family members got better after an illness, when we got back on our feet after an academic or a professional setback, when we found love again after a painful breakup. It's part of the human condition to go through the ups and the downs. Each of us will eventually find ourselves in a personal Egypt, a narrow or tight place that challenges our ability to keep our sights focused on what is core. With this knowledge in mind, we can use the times when we are strong, joyful, healthy, and connected to form habits that we can draw on when we are mired in trouble. For the Hasidic students who found such elation in Shabbat, their well was overflowing and they could easily access that feeling even on a Tuesday. For the Israelites in Egypt, they could draw on our generational hope and faith to make it through the dark times. For us here in New York City in 2023, we can cultivate a practice of connecting with people we love and people we are committing to be in community with, so that we can draw on those connections when we need them. So my theme is about making sure we can all access Shabbat, not by dumbing it down or changing it to a more convenient time of the week, but by creating more access points, more invitations to make it your own, to create your own well from which to draw strength, calm, clarity, and loving relationships. Let's start with the simplest access point. 2 words: Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, associated with the root shav, shev, shiv, to be still, and shalom, from shleimut, wholeness, completion. We say it with a smile, often a handshake or a fist bump, or a wink, maybe even a whole hug and a kiss. It feels good to say the words and to hear them, perhaps because the words themselves connote a new day, a reminder that this weekly gift of sacred time has arrived. As a child, my mom, who's sitting right next to Rabbi Kaufman, always lit the Shabbat candles, then blew a kiss. Shabbat Shalom. As she did this, I could see her shoulders relax with an exhale. It's here. Thank God. Shabbat is here. My husband Bradley and I are lucky enough to be with my parents most weeks for Shabbat, and we've embraced this practice ourselves. For each of us, this moment may feel different, and I think that's the point. We actively create a distinction in time, and the moment of awareness might be quite brief. I invite us to think about Shabbat as an invitation to try in a different way of being, for just a breath or for the full 25 hours. As you heard from my introduction, I lead an organization, OneTable. It's entirely focused on making Shabbat accessible to young adults at a time of their lives when they are the least likely to join a congregation, when they are more likely to be living on their own, far from family, and learning from themselves how to distinguish between work and play, friendship and love, ritual practice and identity. And I can tell you that as the world goes ever more complex, Shabbat is becoming more appealing. For this reason alone, I think it's our obligation to introduce Shabbat as a sacred moment for connection to each other, to tradition, to rest, to our bodies, our minds, and the earth. And Shabbat is hot these days. In the past month, you heard we've been featured in The Atlantic, New York Times, Style section, no less, National Public Radio, Good Morning America. Perhaps the lengthiest public conversation was a few weeks ago on Aliza Kline's January 3rd podcast episode called Shabbat and the Art of Rest. There were some beautiful moments in that hour-long recording. I encourage you to listen, but there were also some cringy ones. I wished I could have called in. Ezra describes being deeply affected by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, The Sabbath, which we'll learn more about today, having read it a dozen times. But from the onset of the episode, Shabbat is always beyond his reach. He quotes Heschel right at the beginning. 6 days a week we seek to dominate the world. On the seventh day, we try to dominate the self. And then with angst, Ezra's commentary is, it's amazing how much harder that is to do. Ezra exposes his own struggles, aloud to himself, to us listeners, and to his interviewee, Judith Shulevitz, whose 2010 book, The Sabbath World, reflects her own personal journey toward deeper understanding and practice. She speaks beautifully about why our tradition frames Shabbat with guardrails, the barriers, the things we do and don't do on Shabbat. And she suggests they're there to try to create meaning. Offers this beautiful line. You could think of it as a break after a line of poetry. Beautiful, setting Shabbat apart, finding delight in the distinction. Unsatisfied, Ezra continues with his probing questions about his own personal connection to Shabbat and the barriers he experiences. He says, I actually don't know how to rest. And I can sometimes not work, but the things I tend to replace it with look a lot like work. I carry around a lot more Sabbath guilt. I really wanted to call in. And I know that your clergy and educators here at Park Avenue Synagogue join me in this. The guilt is counterproductive and exhausting. Let's set aside the guilt. Let's start with that simple Shabbat Shalom. Let's start with an invitation, a yes, not a no. When OneTable started, we studied the benefits of celebrating Shabbat, of course. We also studied the barriers that keep people from enjoying this gift. We uncovered technical barriers like jobs keeping people at work until 8 p.m. on a Friday, financial barriers like the cost of hosting 8 or so people for dinner, social barriers, what if no one comes, physical barriers, my apartment's the size of a shoebox, and then eventually we got to Jewish barriers around confidence and competence. I don't know those blessings, or I don't remember them. Each of our interventions was designed to address the barriers and ultimately to empower those young adults to literally set their own tables. We offer a tech platform to organize dinners, to match hosts with guests, nourishment credit, which provides financial support, one-on-one Shabbat coaching on topics ranging from ritual to dinner party planning, and we send out a lot of reminders. In fact, every Tuesday. Shabbat is coming. Don't forget. OneTable has been designed with the life stage of young adults in mind, though of course, Shabbat itself is a constant, and we can interact with it differently throughout our lives. We collect stories, feelings, dinner invitations. One of my favorite daily rituals is to look through the stories that we collect, like this one from Sarah. She's a first-time host, just 3 weeks ago, and she hosted her first dinner. Her friends, old and new, stayed past midnight talking, and she writes, "This is what feeds my soul. building meaningful community around food, conversation, and the full presence of each other. To me, Shabbat allows us to just take a break from all the doing and just be, to exist in what is, in all that we are right now, and for that to be enough. I would love to introduce Ezra Kline to Sarah. The truth is, there's some of Ezra's angst in all of us. There's always more that we could be doing, and sometimes knowing that keeps us from even doing a little. So let's all agree that we can learn from Sarah and the thousands of other young adults like her who are learning to embrace the sweetness of Shabbat, that sense of being enough, even just for a moment. Maybe we start by turning off our laptops and phones on Friday with a deep breath and a little Shabbat Shalom to ourselves. Just that action can transform the end of the work week into sacred time. Maybe on Friday afternoons, we send texts or emails or even phone calls to people that we love but don't see every day with a Shabbat Shalom, a weekly check-in, a love note. Maybe on Saturdays we carve time to read a book, a magazine, something printed. Maybe Saturday becomes yes day for those with younger kids at home. That means we're all together as a family, and our first answer to their requests is yes. I remember getting chocolate milk only on Saturdays, and now look at me. And maybe we say yes to invitations, or we invite others into our homes, with Shabbat as our reason, our anchor for doing things differently than we do the rest of the hectic week. Maybe we light candles, raise a glass, break bread, and delight in being together. How fitting that our parashah is Bo. Come in. You are invited to take your place at the table. Carve for yourself a moment of Shabbat. It is always here for you. Shabbat Shalom.